A shipment of gold from Burkina Faso worth hundreds of millions of dollars was seized at a European port. No legal case, no accident. It was politics. Under direct pressure from Washington, the containers never reached their destination. And then came Trump's voice, sharp and unapologetic. If Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its dues. In Ouagadougou, the news hit like an earthquake for President Ibrahim Traoré. This was not business. It was robbery. The gold mined by his people, the very wealth meant to fund schools, hospitals, and food security, had been turned into collateral for debts dictated by outsiders. Crowds filled the streets, anger spreading faster than fire. "They steal in daylight and call it law," shouted one man at a rally. The truth was undeniable. If Africa's gold could be stopped and seized, then sovereignty itself was under siege. This was the spark, a humiliation that could have broken a nation, but instead pushed Traoré to fight back. What began as a single shipment seized at a port was about to ignite a battle over Africa's right to control its own future. The seizure was not a mistake. It was strategy. In Washington, Trump framed it as a lesson to the Sahel. If they want the benefits of global trade, they must honor their debts. Behind the cameras, officials admitted the truth. This was about the IMF. For decades, Africa's loans had been tied to conditions written in Washington and Paris. The International Monetary Fund demanded repayment in dollars backed by guarantees. But as African nations like Burkina Faso turned toward new partners in BRICS and India, the West grew nervous. What if those loans went unpaid? What if Africa simply walked away from the system? Trump's answer was brutal. Hold the gold by pressuring Europe to seize Burkina Faso's shipment. Washington sent a message. Your resources are collateral. Whether you agree or not, the logic was cold but clear. If Africa tried to shift away from the IMF, its most valuable asset would be frozen before leaving port in Ouagadougou. The revelation spread quickly. Ministers told Traoré the gold had been classified as security against outstanding debt. Debt that in many cases had been inherited from past regimes or forced through under colonial terms. Debt that had already drained more than it ever gave to the people. It was the final insult. A farmer interviewed on local radio said, "We never signed those loans. Why should our gold pay for them?" A teacher added, "If they keep our gold, they are keeping the future of our children." Traoré stood before his cabinet and spoke plainly. This is not about debt. This is about control. If they succeed, Africa will never own its tomorrow. The seizure had achieved its purpose in Washington, but in Africa, it was fueling something much more dangerous. Unity. If you believe Traoré's courage is the voice of Africa, share your thoughts in the comments. The streets of Ouagadougou erupted with anger, not confusion, anger. The news spread through radios, WhatsApp groups, and loudspeakers in the markets. The gold was not stolen by pirates, nor delayed by storms. It was seized deliberately as collateral for debts tied to the IMF. Mothers who had struggled to buy bread shouted in protest, "Who's that? Ours or theirs?" Youths carried signs that read, "Our gold is not your guarantee." The outrage was not only about money. It was about betrayal. The realization that the wealth of Africa was still treated as property in someone else's vault. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré gathered his closest advisors. Some urged diplomacy. "We can negotiate the release." One minister suggested nervously, "Offer repayment schedules as compromise." But others shook their heads. The room was heavy with silence until Traoré rose. His voice was calm but sharp. "They want us to bow. They want us to pay debts we did not choose. With gold we have mined with our blood. If we bend today, there will be nothing left to stand on tomorrow." His words rippled through the chamber. For the first time, the cabinet understood this was not just a financial dispute. It was an attack on sovereignty itself. Meanwhile, protests swelled. Miners marched from the gold fields carrying tools aloft as symbols of resistance. Students staged sit-ins at universities demanding Burkina Faso leave IMF dependency altogether. Even soldiers muttered in the barracks, "If they can seize gold, what will they seize next?" Western media framed it differently. Of course, CNN called Traoré. European commentators spoke of African instability. But inside Africa, the narrative was changing. The people did not see recklessness. They saw defiance. And in that defiance, Ibrahim Traoré sensed an opening. The seizure had been meant to humiliate Burkina Faso. Instead, it was uniting a continent around a single truth. Africa's wealth could no longer be entrusted to foreign hands. The crisis had reached its breaking point. For days, Burkina Faso's newspapers carried a single headline: "Gold seized. Nation betrayed." Radio hosts repeated Trump's words, "Africa must pay its dues," until they echoed like a challenge carved into stone. The West thought it had made Africa kneel. But Ibrahim Traoré had other plans. He summoned an emergency session with leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States. Malian responded immediately, sending envoys to Ouagadougou. Their message was simple. Your gold is our fight too. Around the table, frustration burned. Each country had stories of shipments delayed, reserves frozen, or contracts rewritten at the stroke of a foreign pen. The seizure was not an isolated act. It was part of a system. Traoré laid out the reality. They are holding our gold because they know it is our strength. They call it collateral. I call it ransom. And if we accept this, the ransom will never end. The room fell silent. Then a minister from Mali broke it. What if we stop sending gold through their ports? What if we keep it here in Africa? Heads turned. For the first time, a radical thought became a real possibility. Build an African reserve beyond the reach of IMF or European treasuries. Outside, momentum was building. Protesters didn't just demand the gold's release. They demanded change. Youth groups painted murals showing Africa's resources chained to Western banks. Farmers pledged to contribute to a people's fund that would back any move toward financial independence. Western governments dismissed the talk as fantasy. One European official scoffed. They don't have the infrastructure or the unity. But what they underestimated was the one resource Africa had in abundance: determination. And at the heart of that determination was Ibrahim Traoré, ready to turn a scandal into the first step toward liberation. The proposal was bold, almost unthinkable. An African gold reserve created and guarded on African soil out of the reach of Paris, Brussels, or Washington. For decades, such an idea had been dismissed as a dream. Now, after the humiliation at the European port, it sounded less like fantasy and more like survival. In the meeting hall, debate erupted. Some ministers warned of disaster. If we break from the IMF, sanctions will crush us, argued one delegate. Another cautioned, without Western insurance, our exports will stall. Our economies could suffocate. Fear lingered in every corner of the room. But Traoré cut through the noise. They already suffocate us. Did the IMF save us when reserves were frozen? Did sanctions feed our people? No. They steal with one hand and offer loans with the other. Enough. His voice steadied the chamber. Support came swiftly. Niger's representative stood. Our uranium is theirs only because we let them ship it. Why should we not guard it ourselves? Mali's minister added. We have watched for years as our gold left our soil only to fund their banks. If this is the moment to stop, then let it be now. Beyond the walls, the message spread. News outlets across Africa began to talk openly about the gold reserve. Analysts explained how pooling resources could shield the Sahel from currency manipulation. On the streets, people chanted, "Keep the gold, build the vault." The idea had taken root in Europe. Alarm Balsang financial newspapers warned of dangerous populism behind closed doors. Memos described the project as a threat to the stability of international markets. Yet the more they condemned it, the more legitimacy it gained in Africa. For the first time in generations, African leaders were not reacting to the West. They were planning for themselves. And Traoré knew even the hint of unity could change the balance of power forever. The decision could no longer remain talk. Traoré ordered his economic advisors and military chiefs to draft the first concrete steps. The plan was simple in principle but revolutionary in practice. Stop sending gold through European ports and begin building the infrastructure to keep it within Africa. Meetings were held in secret locations. Engineers outlined how vaults could be constructed in secure zones reinforced with military protection. Economists mapped out how reserves from Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger could be pulled into a joint stock, a foundation for an African financial shield. But Traoré knew this was not just about concrete walls or ledgers. It was about trust. At a gathering of AS leaders, he spoke directly. If we build this vault, it will not belong to Burkina Faso, nor Mali, nor Niger. It will belong to Africa. Our children must know that their wealth is stored where no foreign hand can touch it. The words carried weight. For decades, mistrust between neighbors had kept cooperation fragile. Yet the image of gold being seized overseas had burned a scar deep enough to unite them. On the ground, preparations began. Special units were assigned to guard gold convoys inside national borders. Contracts with Western refineries were quietly reviewed and in some cases cancelled. Negotiations opened with partners in BRICS to provide refining technology directly to the Sahel. For the first time, Africa was positioning itself not as a supplier of raw materials, but as a guardian of value. Western intelligence picked up signals of the shift. Reports warned that if the African gold reserve became real, it could undermine IMF leverage across the continent. Officials debated whether to tighten sanctions or attempt quiet diplomacy. Neither option looked promising. In Ouagadougou, Traoré stood before a small crowd of miners and told them plainly, "You are not digging for Paris. You are not digging for Washington. From now on, your work will build Africa's strength." The applause was thunderous. The reserve was still only an idea on paper, but in the hearts of the people, it was already real. The West did not wait quietly. Within days of the AES announcement, European financial institutions began to strike back. Banks in Paris and Brussels froze transactions linked to Burkina Faso and its allies. Insurance companies suddenly refused coverage for shipments, leaving West Africa. Even humanitarian aid shipments were delayed for review. The message was clear. Resistance would come at a price. Trump, never one to soften his words, doubled down. At a press conference he declared, "These young leaders think they can defy the rules. But if Africa wants to sit at the table of global trade, it must first learn to follow the law." To him, the law was IMF contracts and dollar dominance. Anything else was chaos. Western media amplified the narrative. Newspapers called the African gold reserve a reckless gamble. Talk shows labeled Traoré too young, too dangerous. Analysts warned of famine, instability, even state collapse. It was psychological warfare designed to scare the people back into obedience. But in Ouagadougou the opposite happened. The more the West threatened, the more the people rallied. Demonstrations filled the streets with chants of "Our gold, our Africa." Farmers offered to donate part of their harvest to support the reserve. Students posted viral messages online. If they fear it this much, then it must be our only hope. Traoré understood the stakes. He gathered his generals and advisors. They will starve us, smear us, and isolate us. But they cannot break us unless we let them. This is not about gold anymore. This is about freedom itself. The reaction in the West was one of disbelief. They had expected fear. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous: conviction. The countermeasures escalated quickly. European regulators announced new trade restrictions, making it nearly impossible for Sahel states to sell gold or other minerals on Western markets. Cargo ships bound for Asia was stopped for inspections. International banks tightened their rules, cutting off credit lines to companies linked to Burkina Faso. It was economic warfare under the banner of financial compliance. But if the West thought this would break Traoré, they underestimated the shifting tides of geopolitics in Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi. The news was followed with sharp interest. Within weeks, envoys from BRICS arrived in Ouagadougou with quiet offers, direct gold purchases, technology to refine and secure reserves locally, and most importantly, markets that did not bow to Washington's pressure for Traoré. This was confirmation. They wanted to isolate us, he told his cabinet, but they have only opened new doors. Agreements were signed in principle, creating alternative routes for trade that bypassed Europe entirely. It was a lifeline, not yet a victory, but a sign that Burkina Faso would not stand alone. Meanwhile, the streets continued to swell with energy. Youth groups painted murals of gold bars breaking free from chains. Farmers organized cooperatives to support the government's plan. Even the military, once cautious, issued a statement: "We stand with the people and their chosen leader." Western media reacted with panic. An editorial in a London paper warned, if Africa aligns with BRICS on gold, it will destabilize the dollar itself. Trump in a televised speech accused Traoré of selling Africa to the East. But the words rang hollow. To many Africans they revealed the truth. The West's fear was not about corruption or instability. It was about losing control. And as that realization spread, what had begun as a regional crisis was turning into a continental awakening. By the end of the month, the economic blockade had failed to break Burkina Faso. The African gold reserve was still only in its early stages, but the idea had taken root so deeply that no sanction could erase it. For the West, frustration turned into something darker. Intelligence reports leaked to Ouagadougou revealed unusual financial flows. Large sums wired to opposition figures and shadowy NGOs. Traoré's advisors suspected what many already whispered. Foreign powers were preparing a plan B. If gold and sanctions could not stop him, perhaps division and betrayal would. Small protests appeared in the capital, waving banners that looked suspiciously well-funded. Anonymous pamphlets accused Traoré of selling Africa to Russia and China, echoing the exact language used by Trump days earlier. Some army officers received mysterious offers of money and asylum if they would correct the course of Burkina Faso. But Traoré was not blind. His network of civilian intelligence and independent journalists tracked the moves carefully. In one televised address, he warned the nation, "They tried to starve us. They tried to silence us. Now they try to turn us against each other. But we will not be divided." The effect was immediate. Citizens organized neighborhood watch groups determined to root out provocators. Students patrolled their campuses, exposing fake organizations set up to spread propaganda. The military high command, instead of wavering, issued a rare joint statement. "Our loyalty is to the Republic, not to foreign hands." In Europe, officials debated next steps. Some urged restraint, fearing exposure. Others demanded escalation. Trump, as always, was blunt. "If you want to kill an idea, you do it before it grows. Otherwise it will bury you." But by then it was too late. The idea had already grown. The gold was more than metal now. It was a flag, a symbol, and symbols are not so easily seized. Just when the pressure seemed unbearable, an unexpected breakthrough shook the narrative. Documents surfaced not from Africa this time, but from within Europe itself. A whistleblower leaked internal memos from a major European bank revealing what many had suspected: the gold seizure at the port had not been a neutral act of regulation. It was ordered directly under pressure from Washington, with explicit instructions to classify African gold as collateral for IMF debts. The memos went further. They detailed discussions of contingency plans, including covert funding for opposition groups in Burkina Faso and neighboring states, all designed to derail the African Gold Reserve project. The language was blunt, even arrogant. One line read, "Without control of their gold, IMF leverage will collapse. This cannot be allowed." When the documents reached African media, the effect was explosive. The West could no longer deny its role. What had been framed as responsibility was exposed as coercion. Traoré addressed his people with measured fury. They said this was law. But law is not written in secret memos. Law is not the theft of another nation's wealth. They have confirmed what we already knew. This is not about debt. This is about domination. The revelation flipped the script. What had been Africa on the defensive was now the West scrambling to justify its actions. And in that reversal, Traoré's stance shifted from resistance to triumph. The leak spread like wildfire. African newspapers ran front-page headlines, "Our gold, their debt." On radio stations from Dar to Kinshasa, callers shouted with outrage, "They steal and call it justice." For millions, the memos were not just evidence. They were vindication of everything they had long believed. In Ouagadougou, tens of thousands filled Independence Square. Miners held up their tools as symbols of defiance. Farmers carried baskets of grain, declaring they would support the nation even if imports were cut. Students waved banners. "Our gold is our freedom." The mood was no longer anger. It was pride. Across the Sahel, leaders who had hesitated now leaned in. Mali's president declared, "If they seize one of us, they seize all of us." Niger's delegation pledged uranium reserves to strengthen the African gold reserve. Guinea spoke of channeling bauxite revenues into the same system. The reserve, once an idea born of crisis, was now a continental project. Western governments scrambled. Trump raged that fake leaks were undermining order. European officials tried to deny, but the signatures on the memos were undeniable. What was meant to weaken Traoré had only made him stronger. In a fiery address, he summed it up. "They wanted to bury us with shame. Instead, they have planted a seed, and that seed is unity." The invisible coup had failed. The seized gold had backfired. And Ibrahim Traoré had risen as a symbol of defiance for an entire continent. Burkina Faso did not regain the seized gold, but in losing it, Africa discovered something greater. What was taken by force became the spark of unity. What was meant as humiliation became the foundation of a new future. The African Gold Reserve was no longer just a proposal on paper. It became a living project built from the sacrifices of miners, the courage of farmers, the resolve of students, and the vision of leaders who refused to bow for the first time. Gold, Africa's oldest treasure, was guarded by Africans for Africans. Ibrahim Traoré stood before a sea of flags at the AS summit and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. They thought our gold was collateral. But it is not collateral. It is freedom. And freedom does not beg. It builds across the continent. People felt it. The winds of change. The awakening of dignity. The rebirth of sovereignty. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to the channel to follow the journey of an Africa that no longer bows its head. God bless Africa.